It was just another afternoon of exploration. The trail seemed ordinary until I stumbled into that old, dusty box. It was just another one of those afternoons where I went out to explore the trails near home. I was never the kind of person who likes sports or excitement, so getting into the woods has always been my way to escape from the routine. The trail was common, the same one I had already traveled dozens of times, but that afternoon everything seemed a little more still. No wind, no birds, only the muffled sound of my footsteps on earth. That's when it happened. I stumbled on something that was partially buried, a kind of old box and all dusty. It was made of wood, looked like it had been handmade, and was sealed with a rusty wire. The first thing that came into my head was, who the hell would leave this here? It didn't seem like garbage. It was intentional, as if someone had hidden that. When I opened the box, I felt chilled at once. Inside it was a VHS tape covered in dust, and some papers folded carelessly. The notes were full of strange symbols, as if they were cryptographs, and some drawings that made no sense. Shapes that seemed a mixture of faces and something more abstract, almost disturbing. My instinct was to leave everything there and go home, but curiosity spoke louder. I put everything in my backpack, trying to ignore the inconvenience that it caused me, and came back in a hurry. With each step, it seemed that the silence around me became more oppressive, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I got home and went straight to my room. I threw the backpack on the floor and took out the tape and papers carefully, as if some part of me still thought that it could be a problem. The VHS was black, without any label or marking, just a common tape that already seemed too old to even work. I looked at the papers again, but nothing made sense. The notes were in a language or code I had never seen, and the drawings made me more uncomfortable the longer I spent looking at them. My room, which has always been my refuge, suddenly seemed cramped, almost suffocating. But I had to see what was on that tape. I needed to know. Dragged the old VCR that was played in the corner of the room and connected to the TV. It still worked, by some miracle, and the tape slipped with a rough noise when I put it on. As soon as I pressed play, the screen went black for a few seconds before starting. What first appeared was a grainy image of a forest, probably the same one where I had found the box. The camera was shaking, as if someone were walking and filming. There was no sound, only static noise from the VHS. But what bothered me was the feeling that something was wrong, as if the whole video was imbued with a strange energy. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the middle of the image in the background. It looked like a person, but you couldn't see his face. They were completely motionless. The figure was far away in the middle of the screen, but it did not move. It was as if it had frozen there, while the camera continued to shake slightly. I was staring, waiting for some movement, but nothing happened. It was just that figure standing in the middle of the forest, like a shadow standing. Then suddenly the screen was static, and a low sound and metallic began to come out of the TV. It was not like the usual squeal of an old tape. It was more like whispers, but fast and confusing, impossible to understand. That's when the image came back, and this time the camera seemed to be closer to the figure. I didn't see the moment she walked or moved, but it was clearly closer. My heart started to shoot. I leaned forward without realizing, as if to understand what I was seeing, but the truth is that it caused me a growing dread. The camera trembled even more, and this time you could hear muffled steps, as if someone was walking slowly through the bush. The figure was still, but there was something wrong with its shape. It looked human, but had something strange in the silhouette, as if it was bent in an impossible way. The tape was cut and returned several times, as if it had been edited, but in a completely chaotic way. In one of the cuts, the camera suddenly turned to the ground, showing the forest soil. But what made me freeze was the sound that came next, a loud snap, like breaking branches, followed by a panting breath that did not seem to be from the cameraman. It was almost animalesque, as if something was there, near to the person who was filming, or worse, near me. At that moment, every part of my body said to turn off the TV, but I just couldn't. It was as if something held me there, forcing me to continue watching. The camera lifted again, but now the figure had disappeared. The focus returned to the forest, empty and silent. It was then that I realized something that was not there before. In the corner of the screen, there was something hanging on a tree. It looked like some kind of amulet made of twigs and ropes, similar to one of those drawings that were on the papers inside the box. The camera slowly began to approach this object, but the movements were erratic, almost as if the person filming was being pushed against his will. Then the tape jumped. Suddenly, the figure was back, but this time much closer to the camera. It was impossible to say how she had gotten there so fast, or even moved, but now I could see something more frightening. She had no face. It was a humanoid silhouette, but where the face should be, there was only a smooth surface like a wax mask or something. At that moment, the TV turned off by itself. I was sitting there frozen, staring at the black screen, with the noise of the tape still running inside the video cassette. The only thing that broke the silence was the sound of my own heartbeats, so loud they seemed to echo through the room. For a few seconds, I was completely still, trying to process what had just happened. Then the TV turned on again, but the screen was full of static. The sound of whispers came back, but this time it was louder, clearer. I could have sworn there were words in the midst of that chaos, but they were in a language I did not recognize. The camera seemed to be recording again, but now it showed the interior of a house. The place was in ruins, with old furniture covered with dust and strange marks on the walls, like scratches or symbols. The air in my room seemed to be heavier, as if something was crawling inside me. I started sweating cold. It was then that I realized the scenery in the video was frighteningly similar to my house. The camera was slow through the rooms, as if whoever was filming knew the place very well. Every detail was an exact replica of my space, until the layout of when the camera came to my room door. My breath was stuck. I was very tired. The footage showed someone sitting on the floor, back to the camera, exactly where I was sitting at that moment. The person wore the same clothes as me, and the silhouette was identical to mine. The VHS made a loud noise, as if it was locking, and the screen blinked several times before freezing in that image. It was only then that I realized the most disturbing sound of all. Steps coming from the corridor of my house, slow but closer and closer. The steps in the corridor were heavy and spaced, each echoing like a thunder in my head. My instinct was to get up, run, do anything, but I was paralyzed. It was as if my mind was screaming, but my body did not obey. I kept looking at the screen, where the image of the person sitting on his back remained static, but it seemed alive, as if breathing, even though the footage was clearly of an inanimate object. Then the steps stopped outside my bedroom door. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know if I should scream, open the door, or just close my eyes and hope it was a dream. Out of nowhere, the VCR spat the tape hard, and the TV turned off again. The room was plunged into an oppressive silence, but I could feel that I was no longer alone there. The feeling was so palpable that it seemed as if the air was being moved around me. It was then that I heard the most disturbing sound of all, 3 slow and steady knocks on my bedroom door. It seemed impossible, because I had not heard the door of the house open, nor anyone entering. The beats were followed by a low sound, almost a whisper coming from the other side, but it was not a human voice. It was something guttural, like a throat noise mixed with words that made no sense. I could barely breathe. At that moment, fear took hold of me in a way I had never felt before. My whole body seemed frozen, but my mind was in complete chaos. The beats ceased, and the silence that came after was even worse. I forced myself to stand up, each movement seeming a struggle against an invisible force. I walked to the door with trembling steps, almost stumbling on my own feet. When I leaned my ear into the wood, I heard something from the other side. It was as if someone was breathing, but the sound was irregular, choppy, as if trying to imitate a human breath and failing miserably. With courage I didn't know where it came from, I turned the handle and opened the door in one blow. There was no one. The hallway was empty, but the feeling that something was wrong just got stronger. The air seemed dense, as if charged with electricity. My heart was still racing when I heard a sound coming from the room. It was the same static sound of the tape, only now it seemed to be coming from all directions at once. I looked back into my room and saw something that almost made me lose my balance. In the reflection of the TV off, there was a figure standing right behind me. My whole body was stuck. It was the same figure on the tape, faceless, with that strangely distorted silhouette. It was so close that I could feel something behind me, like a cold breeze brushing my neck. I tried to turn around, but it was as if my muscles had given up on me. In the TV reflection, I saw the figure slowly start to lean towards me. There were no eyes, mouth, or any human trace, but I felt with every fiber of my being that it was looking at me, or studying me. The sound of static seemed to get louder inside my head, to the point of being almost unbearable. Without warning, the lights of the house began to flash wildly, casting shadows on all sides. In the middle of this chaos, I finally managed to move and turn to face whatever was there. But there was nothing. The corridor behind me was empty, no sign of the figure or anything else. The static sound disappeared as fast as it had begun, leaving behind an overwhelming silence. I went back to the room, shaking, and saw that the tape, the papers, and even the box had disappeared. Everything was exactly the same as before, as if nothing had happened. I just knew something was wrong. The feeling of being watched was not gone. And to this day, no matter where I am, I still feel that there is something following me, waiting. The first look, I didn't know if it was worse to watch or imagine what was on the tape. When I got home, I stood for a while looking at the tape. I didn't know if I really wanted to watch or if it was better to leave it where it was and pretend that I had never found it. But curiosity won. Dragged my old VCR from a closet and connected it to the TV, feeling that strange shiver that had already accompanied me since the track. When the tape started, the screen went black for a few seconds before a shaky image of a forest appeared. It was hard to say for sure, but it looked a lot like the place where I had found the box. The recording was full of noise, static, and that low sound that reminded me of whispers. It was almost imperceptible, but it didn't feel natural. As the footage continued, the camera shook as if the person was walking through the forest. There was no defined path, only trees and more trees. The whispers were louder at times, but never clear enough to understand what they said. What really started to bother me was the camera's rhythm. Sometimes she stopped abruptly and seemed to focus on something I could not identify, as if there was something in the background of the image, hidden among the trees. I leaned forward, trying to see better, but everything seemed blurry. And then at the end of the recording, the camera stopped shaking and was fixed. In the distance, almost imperceptible, I could see a figure standing among the trees, motionless, as if he was looking at me directly through the screen. My heart went crazy the moment I saw that figure. No detail could be seen. It looked human, but something was wrong. The posture was too rigid, almost artificial, and it seemed that he was just watching. I kept looking at the screen, waiting for some movement, but nothing happened. Only that annoying silence, broken by the low sound of static. For a second, I considered turning off the TV, but couldn't. It was like my eyes were stuck on that. It was then that the camera began to approach the figure slowly, as if being guided by its own will. My stomach is wrapped. With each step, the face of the figure became closer, but still remained blurred, as if the tape itself refused to show clearly. When the camera came a few meters from the figure, it stopped again. And suddenly the image started to blink, alternating between static and a close-up of what should be the face. Only there was no face. It was just a flat emptiness, without eyes, mouth, or any human trace. At that moment, the whispers became louder, almost deafening, as if they came from the TV itself and not from the recording. It was then that the tape locked and released a high-pitched, shrill sound that made me jump back. The screen went black and everything was silent. But that silence was not normal. It was as if the air around me had become heavy, dense, and every shadow in the room seemed to be moving. I sat on the floor, trying to catch my breath. The TV was still on, but it was completely dark, as if it had turned off by itself, although the low static noise still came from the video cassette. I couldn't decide what was worse, the figure I had seen or the silence that took over afterwards. The sound, even weak, seemed to echo in my head, as if it was stuck in my ears. My hand trembled as I stood up to take the tape, but the moment I touched the video cassette, the TV turned on by itself. The image came back with the same figure as before, but now it was much closer to the camera. She occupied almost the entire screen, but still had no face. It was like looking at a void that made no sense, but gave me an almost physical feeling of discomfort. It was then that I realized something that made me freeze. Behind the figure, in the image of the TV, there were trees that looked exactly like those of my backyard. I knew that I could be imagining things, but the idea that this place could be here, so close, left me breathless. The figure stood there, motionless, while the sound of whispers began to change. Now it looked more like an irregular breath, like someone trying to control their own anger, slow and heavy. It was at that moment that the light of my room blinked, and I swear I heard a noise coming from the window. Frozen, I turned my face slowly towards the window, with the feeling that something was watching me. The room seemed darker than it should, as if the light of the lamp was not enough to illuminate everything. When I finally looked at the glass, I saw nothing, at least not immediately. But there was something wrong there. It was as if the darkness outside were denser, almost solid. My reflection seemed distorted, as if it was not exactly mine. Suddenly, a dry sound, like something hitting the glass slightly, echoed in the silence. It was low, but close enough to make me hold my breath. Without courage to come closer, I took my phone on the table and activated the flashlight, lit the window, trying to convince myself that there was nothing there, but what I saw completely pulled me off the ground. In the corner of the glass, almost imperceptible, there was a mark. It looked like a hand, but it wasn't human. The fingers were too long, thin, and disproportionate, and the shape seemed to have been left by something wet or oily. Before I could react, I heard a noise behind me coming from the corridor. It was the sound of slow, deliberate steps, as if someone were walking directly toward me. My heart pounded. There was no way to ignore it. Something or someone was inside my house. The steps continued closer and closer, and I could barely breathe. I took anything that was within my reach, an old pair of scissors on the computer table, and turned to face the corridor. It was dark, but something seemed wrong with the shadows. They were not motionless as they should be. They were subtle, almost imperceptible, but seemed to move slightly, as if the darkness itself was breathing. My chest seemed to explode, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, scissors in hand, trying to convince myself that it wasn't real. It was then that the lights of the house began to flash again, accompanied by a low sound, almost like a hum, which seemed to come from within the walls. In the middle of this chaos, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. A figure appeared at the end of the corridor. She was tall, thin, and looked bent in an impossible way, as if her bones did not follow the normal rules of the human body. I couldn't see her face, or maybe she didn't have one, but the worst was the movement. It wasn't natural. It was as if each step was fragmented, a snap each time she got closer. And despite the panic, I stood there, paralyzed, waiting for something to happen. The figure kept approaching, its movements strangely mechanical and tortuous. Each snap echoed through the corridor, and with every step it seemed that the air around me became heavier, almost impossible to breathe. My instincts were screaming to run, but my body just didn't react. She stopped a few meters from me, and at that moment, the lights stopped blinking, plunging everything into a suffocating gloom. It was only then that I noticed something even more disturbing: the smell. It was a metallic odor, mixed with something rotten, as if there were decomposing meat there, but nothing visible that would explain where it came from. Suddenly, the figure tilted his head as if he was analyzing me, and began to emit a low sound, almost like a hiss mixed with a whisper. They were not words, but I could feel the intention behind it, as if I was trying to communicate something that I did not have the ability to understand. The feeling of being observed became so intense that I almost fainted. It was then, without warning, the figure disappeared. It didn't walk, it didn't move. It just disappeared, as if it had never been there. The corridor was empty, but I knew deep down that it didn't mean I was alone. At the same instant, the TV in the room turned on again, the screen showing only static. Only now, in the middle of the hiss, I could hear my own name being whispered over and over again. The sound of my name being whispered from the TV was the drop of a hat. It was impossible to explain, but the voice seemed to know every fear I had, every vulnerability. My instincts told me to run, but I didn't know where to go. I took my phone in an attempt to call someone, but the screen was completely black, as if the device had discharged even being with 80% battery minutes before. I stood there in the middle of the room, while the whisper repeated my name at irregular intervals. It was as if the house itself were trying to arrest me. I tried to turn off the TV, but the remote control did not respond, and when I pressed the buttons of the device, nothing happened. The sound was getting louder, turning into a mixture of whispers and static, until a high-pitched scream echoed through the room. making me fall to the ground. At that moment, all the lights of the house went out at once, plunging everything into absolute darkness. I could hear my own panting breath and the sound of footsteps again, but this time they were not in the hall. They were in the room, around me, as if something was circling. And then, out of nowhere, everything stopped. The TV went off, the lights came back on, and the silence was deafening. The tape, box, and papers were gone. It was as if nothing had happened, but I knew that wasn't the end. Since that day, everywhere I go, I feel like I'm being watched. I can't explain, but it seems that I let something in, not in my house, but in my life. To this day, I can't sleep without the lights on because whenever I look at the darkness, I feel that something is there waiting. A visitor in the darkness. That night, something changed. Not only in my mind, but in my house. That night, something looked different from the moment the sun set. I can't explain exactly what it was, but my house was strange. The silence seemed deeper, as if all normal sounds, the wind, crickets, even street noises, had disappeared. The electric energy fluctuated a few times, which is not common here. The lights blinked irregularly, and I could only think of the figure I saw on the tape. He kept asking me if it was just something in my head, or if I had really brought something with me from that forest. I tried to distract myself by watching something on TV, but honestly it seemed impossible to concentrate on anything. Then I heard the first noise. It was low, like a soft scratch coming from outside near the window of the room. I forced myself to ignore, convincing myself that it was just the wind or some branch scraping against the glass. But as the minutes passed, the sound began to repeat itself in irregular intervals, becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Stood up, hesitantly, and walked to the window. When I opened the curtain, I saw nothing, only the dark yard, lit by the dim light of the street post. But the feeling of being watched was so intense that I started to sweat. There was nothing there, but I could not get rid of the idea that something was staring at me, hidden in the darkness. I closed the curtain quickly, trying to remove that discomfort, but the feeling of being observed did not go away. I decided to turn off the lights in the house, leaving only the one in the hallway on, to see if I could see better outside. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks. Went back to the window, peeking through the crack of the curtain, and that's when I saw it. In the darkest corner of the yard, near the fence, there was something. It was not an object, nor did it look like an animal. It was a shadow, but so solid that it seemed to have weight. It was like a tape, immobile, impossible to identify, but with a presence that gave creeps. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes, and when I looked again, it was no longer there. The energy swung again, this time stronger, and the light of the corridor began to blink. I was taken by an irrational panic, as if something inside me knew that there was something wrong, even without proof. The sound came back, but this time it seemed to be coming from all sides, scratches, light bumps, and that suffocating silence among the noises. I took my phone to try to call someone, but the battery, which was almost full minutes ago, had dropped to 0. A cold came up through my spine, and before I could do anything, I heard the sound of steps outside on the concrete balcony. It was not hasty steps, but deliberate, as if anyone knew exactly where he was going. The steps stopped right at the door of the room. My heart felt like it was going to leave my chest, and I forced myself to be silent, trying to control my breath. I did not have the courage to move, much less to get close to the door. I stood there, standing in the corridor, staring at the knob, waiting for any movement. Then came the sound that made my blood cold, 3 firm knocks on the door. They were not fast nor threatening, but they were also not normal. They seemed calculated, as if anyone on the other side knew I was listening. My mind began to run with possibilities, but none made sense. There was no way anyone could be there. I would have looked through the window. I waited a few seconds, and the beats repeated. This time slower. Took a knife in the kitchen, the closest thing that could give me some comfort, and went to the door with hesitant steps. I looked at the viewfinder, but there was nothing out there. Only the empty yard, the light of the pole blinking in the street, and that overwhelming silence. My instinct was not to open it, but I needed to be sure. With my trembling hand, I unlocked the lock and opened the door a crack, just enough to look out. What I saw made my legs almost give way. On the balcony floor, there were marks of something wet like footprints, but they did not seem human. Before I could react, I felt a slight stream of air pass through me, as if something had entered the house. I closed the door immediately, locking all the latches and slowly moving away. The current seemed to have dissipated, but the feeling that I was no longer alone inside the house became unbearable. My heart beat so hard that I could hear the sound in absolute silence. I went into the corridor, looking in all directions, but there was nothing out of place, at least at first sight. The knife in my hand seemed useless against whatever it was. And then I heard the steps again. This time they came from inside the house, but were impossible to locate. They seemed to echo through all the rooms at once, slow, heavy, and totally out of rhythm with anything natural. I was taken by a fear that I had never felt before. I walked to the room with uncontrolled breathing and locked the door. I turned on the light and stayed inside, trying to think of a logical explanation for what was happening. But before I could reason, the light started to flash. First slowly, then faster, until it went completely out. The room was plunged into a darkness so dense that it seemed solid. Then came the sound. It was a low scratch, coming from outside the door, as if something were sticking its nails into the wood. I pushed back until I was against the wall, my hands shaking so much that I almost dropped the knife. The scratch stopped for a few seconds, and then came something much worse. 3 banging on the door, just like I heard in the room. I held my breath, completely paralyzed. The knocks on the door were slow, calculated, almost mocking. Who, or what, was on the other side knew exactly what he was doing to me. I forced myself not to emit any sound, but my heart seemed so high that, with each beat, I was sure that it could hear. And then came the silence. Not the usual kind of silence, but a complete emptiness where even the sound of my breath didn't seem real. I wanted to believe that it was over, but the tension in the air only increased. Suddenly, the handle started to turn slowly, making a sharp squeak. It was enough to make me almost fall of fright. There was no way anyone could have entered the house. I had locked everything. The handle stopped, and the sound of scratching came back, but this time it did not seem to be on the door. It was as if he was on the ceiling, moving slowly toward the center of the room. I looked up but could not see anything in the darkness. And then something happened that I will never forget. I felt a cold drop fall on my face, automatically past the hand, and my heart almost stopped. It was not water. It was thick like blood. It was at that moment I realized I was no longer alone in the room. Despair took hold of me the moment I felt that cold liquid on my face. The darkness was so dense that it seemed to swallow me, and I knew any false movement could be the last. Shaking, I turned on the flashlight of the phone, even though I knew that the battery was almost out, and pointed to the ceiling. For a brief second I wished he hadn't. There, in the corner of the room, something was stuck between the walls and the ceiling. It was like a solid shadow, but there was a vaguely human form, with arms and legs twisted at impossible angles. No face, only that same smooth and unmarked surface I had seen on the tape. But the worst were the eyes, two deep holes, as if the darkness there was even denser. The cell phone flashlight blinked, and the thing started moving. Slowly, as if it was crawling towards me, without making any sound. It was the most terrifying silence I've ever heard. The room seemed smaller, as if the walls were closing around me. I could not move, just looked completely frozen as it approached, going down the walls in a way that was not natural. The flashlight blinked again and went out, leaving me in total darkness. The last thing I heard was a subtle sound, almost like a low laugh, before everything went completely silent. When the light came back, the room was empty. There was no sign of anything, neither the stain on the ceiling nor the liquid on my face. It seemed like it never happened, but I knew it did. And even today, even with the lights on, I feel that something is still there, hidden, waiting. The second tape. I thought there was only one, but the forest holds secrets. I know I should have left that behind. After what happened with the first tape, it would be logical never to go back there. But curiosity is a dangerous business. For days, I could not get out of my head what I saw, what I felt, and a part of me needed answers. That's how I found myself back on the trail, at the same point where I stumbled into the box for the first time. The forest looked different that morning, as if it was quieter, almost hostile. Each step seemed to echo more than it should, and the silence was so dense that it became oppressive. My plan was simple: take a quick look and go. Not expecting to find anything, but of course I did. This time I did not have to look. Almost as if waiting for me, there was another box, smaller but equally old and worn, a few meters from the original place. As I opened it, I felt that same shiver go up my spine. Inside was a new VHS tape and a folded piece of paper. Unlike the cryptographic notes of the first time, the note had only one sentence: "You will also be observed." My heart popped. It was impossible not to think that someone knew I would be there, that I had left it on purpose. Against all common sense, I put the tape in my backpack and went home, with the feeling that every shadow in the forest was watching me. I came home with sweaty hands and heavy breathing, as if I had run a marathon. I looked at the tape in my backpack, but did not have the courage to touch it immediately. The phrase in the note didn't go out of my head: "You will be observed too." It was as if those words had a weight that I couldn't ignore. I closed all the windows and locked the door, trying to create a false sense of security. Finally, after minutes of staring at the tape, I decided to watch it. I turned on the video cassette, with the same mixture of curiosity and fear that I felt the first time. But this time something was different. I knew I was getting into something bigger, something I probably shouldn't understand. As soon as I pressed play, the screen went black for a while. Then a grainy image appeared. It was the forest again. But this time, it didn't just look like random footage. It was as if the camera was following someone. The footage was shaking so much, as if the person recording it were running, and the sound of hasty steps echoed behind a heavy breath. You could not see the face of who was followed, only the silhouette of a person disappearing among the trees. What made me freeze was that, in the moments when the camera stopped, something in the background of the image seemed to observe the scene. An immobile figure, as before, only now closer. Each cut in the recording, The figure was closer, until it occupied almost the entire screen. My breath became heavier as I watched. The picture seemed almost to touch the camera lens, but even then it was impossible to discern details. No face, no traces, just that oppressive presence that seemed to cross the screen. Then the recording changed abruptly. The camera was now stopped, pointing to a clearing in the forest. In the center, there was something like a circle of stones, surrounded by symbols engraved on the ground. I had a strange feeling, as if I had seen that place before but could not remember where. The silence in the recording was unbearable, interrupted only by distant sounds that seemed like whispers, but distorted, as if they were produced by something that could not speak. Suddenly, the image trembled and fell to the ground, as if the cameraman had been knocked down. The camera was sideways, showing only the ground and part of the vegetation around. It was then that I realized something that almost made me stop watching. A huge shadow passed through the corner of the screen. It was not human. The contours were erratic, as if the very shadow was alive. The breath on the tape became louder, almost frantic, and then I heard something that made the air disappear from my chest. A low, guttural voice coming out of the recording, saying my name. It was not a sound I could confuse. It was exactly my voice being called. When I heard my name being called in that guttural voice, my reaction was almost automatic. I stopped the tape by a jump and turned off the TV. My heart was racing, and the feeling that something was wrong was so strong that I could hardly breathe. The silence in the room was suffocating, but even then I could swear that I still heard that distant whisper repeating my name. My hands trembled as I took the tape off the VCR. The idea that it wasn't just a coincidence started to corrode me. How did that voice know my name? Who recorded it? And why? I decided that I needed to see the end of the recording, even if everything in me screamed not to do it. Put the tape back on the VCR and pressed play, trying to prepare for what came. The screen returned with the same clearing of the forest, but now the camera was moving again. She seemed to be being carried, pointing to the ground, as slow steps echoed. When the camera finally lifted, the image was fixed on something that made me shudder. A figure stood in the clearing, exactly where the stones formed the circle. It was the same faceless figure, but this time it seemed to be looking directly at the camera, or at me. Then, with a sudden movement, she pointed to something off the screen, and the recording cuts to static. I was paralyzed, staring at the static on the screen, but I knew it couldn't be the end. I pushed the forward button to see if there was anything else recorded. After a few seconds of squeaking and black screen, the image came back. The camera now seemed to be filming the interior of a house. My heart almost stopped when I realized it was my home. The corridor, the room, everything was exactly the same, even the small details like the pile of magazines on the table and the coat thrown on the sofa. The camera trembled slightly, as if whoever was filming was walking around the house. The sound of footsteps echoed through the recording, as each room was slowly explored. My entire body was frozen in fear. It was as if I was being observed at that very moment. Then the camera stopped at my bedroom door. The sound of footsteps ceased, and silence took over the recording. Felt my chest tighten, as if something was about to happen. The camera stood there, fixed on the door, for several seconds. My mind was at 1,000, trying to understand how it was possible. But before I could think of anything, the handle began to turn. Slowly, with that same sharp creak I recognized from my own door. The camera slowly moved into the room, and the screen cut again to static. But this time, the hiss came with a low sound like a heavy breath. It was impossible to tell if it came from the tape or from inside my house. That low breath seemed to fill the whole room, and I could not tell whether it was coming from the tape or some dark corner around me. My skin was cold, and I felt every beat of my heart like a drum. The TV screen still showed static, but the sound of breathing continued, becoming increasingly irregular, as if something was about to happen. I decided to turn off the TV at once, but before I could move, the image changed. Suddenly, the camera seemed to be looking at me. It was a view of my room, from the angle of the door, as if someone were standing there recording. The detail that made me want to shout was that I was on the screen, exactly where I was sitting at that moment, with the same terrified look. My eyes widened, and I instinctively turned to the door. There was no one there, but I clearly felt that I was no longer alone. The sound of breathing stopped abruptly, leaving only the most oppressive silence I have ever felt in life. It was then that I realized something even more strange. The TV turned itself off, but the reflection in the dark screen still showed the silhouette of someone standing behind me. It was the same figure of the clearing, immobile, without face, but this time so close that it seemed impossible not to feel his physical presence. When I turned again, the room was empty, but the air around me seemed heavier, almost unbearable. It was as if something had come out of the tape and entered my house. I knew I had to get out of there, but my legs were completely locked. The idea of moving and face it terrified me more than standing still. The room was so silent that the sound of my own breath seemed to echo. I looked at the TV again, but the reflection was clear, as if nothing had happened. I tried to convince myself that it was my imagination, but the weight in the air said otherwise. With a huge effort, I finally got up and walked slowly to the door of the room. Each step seemed an eternity, and the silence was broken only by the creaking of the wooden floor. When I opened the door, the hallway looked darker than usual. The light, which was always on, was blinking, casting shadows in all directions. And that's when I heard it. A low sound, almost imperceptible, but that made me freeze. It was a constant scratch, like long nails scraping on the walls. The sound came from the end of the corridor, where the darkness was denser. My mind screamed for me to go back and lock the door, but something pulled me forward, as if I had no choice. I took the phone to use as a flashlight, but of course the battery was dead, even though I had charged the device hours before. Closer and closer to the end of the corridor, the scratch suddenly stopped, leaving only suffocating silence. And then something whispered behind me, "You're being watched." The sound of those whispered words so close to my ear paralyzed me. I turned in a rush, with my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Only the empty corridor, illuminated by weak and unstable light. The silence that followed was almost deafening, as if the air itself had been sucked. I decided I could not stay in that house anymore. I ran into the room, trying to ignore the feeling that something was after me. Each shadow seemed to move in the corner of my vision, but I could not look back. When I reached the door, I realized that it did not open. The lock was spinning, but something seemed to be holding the door in place. My mind was in panic. I started banging on the door hard, trying to knock it down, while screaming for help. But then I realized something that made me stop. Outside, through the crack of the curtain, I could see the same figure without a face. He was standing on the balcony, motionless, looking directly at the door. His body seemed even more distorted than before, as if it followed no human logic. I did not know what to do. was caught between that presence outside and the overwhelming feeling that something was inside the house with me. It was at that moment that I heard, once again, that sound of scratching, but this time he was coming from all directions at the same time. The sound of the scratch became more intense, as if it was coming from inside the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It was as if the whole house was alive and trying to swallow me. The figure on the balcony remained still, but seemed closer each time I blinked. It didn't make sense, but I had the feeling that she was invading my space without even moving. Slowly I was moving away from the door, trying to convince myself that it was some kind of hallucination. But then the lights began to flash wildly, and the sound of scratching turned into something deeper, almost like a low, muffled roar. Despair took hold. I ran back to the room and locked the door, not even knowing if it would make any difference. The heavy breathing returned, but this time it was inside the room, not outside. It was as if something invisible was surrounding me. My vision was clouded by fear, and all I could do was hold the door handle as if it were to protect me. Then the silence fell suddenly. Without blinking, I looked around, but the room seemed normal. For a brief moment, I thought it might be over. But when I looked at the reflection in the window, I saw. That faceless figure was standing behind me, so close that it seemed to touch my shoulder. I turned so fast that I almost tripped, but the room was empty. There was nothing there, only the overwhelming silence and the feeling that something was watching me. My whole body was shaking, and the air seemed heavy, difficult to breathe. When I looked back at the window, the reflection had also disappeared. Still, the feeling that it was close would not go away. My mind was at 1,000, trying to rationalize what was happening, but nothing made sense. The sentence on the note, "You will also be observed," echoed in my head like a curse, and I began to wonder if that was exactly what was happening. I decided I couldn't stay there another second. With all my strength, I unlocked the door of the room and ran down the corridor towards the exit. The lights still flickered, and the shadows seemed more vivid, as if they were following me. When I finally got to the front door, it opened with a crash, and I went out to the balcony panting. The air outside was cold, but it didn't bring the relief I expected. The figure I had seen before on the tape, that faceless shadow, was now in the middle of the yard. Immobile, but so present that it seemed to occupy all the space around. There was nowhere to run. Then, without warning, the lights of the house went out completely, plunging everything into absolute darkness. When the past speaks, it wasn't just a lost object. It was an echo of something that should never have existed. After everything that happened, I knew I needed to find out more about those tapes. They were not just random objects thrown into the forest. There was something much deeper and more disturbing behind them. I spent hours researching the area where I found the first box, trying to connect the dots. It didn't take long for me to find old news, forgotten articles on little accessed websites, talking about disappearances in that same forest. The stories were frighteningly similar. People who went out for walks or camping and were never seen again. What made me shiver was finding a report from decades ago about a man who disappeared in the same region where I found the first tape. The article had a black and white photo, worn by time, but there was something on his face that looked familiar. It was then that I realized the blurred silhouette in the video had very similar proportions to that man. It wasn't a direct connection, but I couldn't get the idea out of my head. I kept reading, and the story got even stranger. Witnesses said they last saw the man wandering through the forest alone, carrying equipment that included an old camera. He was never found, and the case was filed as disappearance without explanation. My heart popped. Were the tapes somehow connected to him? Or worse, was he the distorted figure I had seen? I kept searching, more and more obsessed with finding some concrete connection between that man and the tapes. I found out that he was an amateur documentary filmmaker, known for exploring remote places and recording what he called echoes of the unknown. The information was vague, but one thing caught my attention. He had a reputation for recording strange things, events that could not be explained, and said to be after something big before disappearing. That would explain the camera and possibly the disturbing content I ended up watching. But there was something that didn't fit. In an interview with a close friend, published months after his disappearance, the person mentioned that the man was constantly talking about being followed. It made my spine shiver. His description of this feeling was frighteningly similar to what I myself was feeling. I couldn't sleep that night. All I could think was, what if the tapes were some kind of record of what happened to him? What if the figure that appeared in the videos was him, or what's left of him? As much as I wanted to believe that I was exaggerating, the feeling of being watched continued. It was as if, by fiddling with that, I had crossed a line that I should not have crossed. I decided to go back to the forest, convinced that only there would find the answers I needed, even if, deep down, I knew it was the worst possible idea. Going back to that forest was, without doubt, the hardest decision I ever made. Everything in me screamed not to go, but the need to understand what was happening was greater. When I arrived, the place seemed even more strange than before. The silence was almost absolute, as if all life had disappeared there. I walked the same way I found the ribbons, looking at every detail around me. I knew I wasn't alone. It was as strong a feeling as being followed, but for some reason no one showed up. Then, in the same place where I found the second tape, I saw something new, a small notebook, worn and covered with earth. Took the notebook carefully and opened. The pages were full of notes, drawings, and symbols that made no sense, but one thing caught my attention. There were written passages that looked like a diary. The handwriting was shaky, as if the person had written in a hurry or with fear. On one of the first pages, I read something that made me freeze. I'm not alone. Every day, I feel they're closer. The recordings are the only way to prove that I'm telling the truth. The date was more than 30 years ago, corresponding to the period in which the documentary filmmaker disappeared. The more I read, the clearer it became that the author of the notebook was him, and that the tapes were part of something much bigger, something he knew could never explain with words. As I moved through the pages of the notebook, the narrative became more and more disturbing. He spoke about figures in the shadows, forms that were not human but seemed conscious, as if they were studying him. One of the more recent notes said, "They don't just watch. They understand. And now they know I know." The writing was more frantic. Words began to overlap, and drawings occupied every free space. They were distorted shapes that vaguely reminded me of the silhouette I saw in the tapes. The worst thing was to find a clear reference to a second tape. If someone finds the first recording, they will come. The second is the warning. Do not watch. My heart popped. The second tape, which I had already watched, was not just a continuation. It was a direct warning. I remembered the words in the note. You will also be observed. It was like a trap, a way to attract more people to the same fate. Suddenly, I heard a crack behind me like a branch breaking. I froze, feeling the blood freezing in my veins. I looked around, but saw nothing, at least at first sight. But then I noticed something that left me paralyzed. Among the trees, in the direction where the sound came from, there was a still shadow. It was exactly like the figure on the ribbon. No face, no movement, but clearly there watching me. My mind panicked the moment I realized the figure among the trees. She was there, motionless, but the feeling that she was watching me was unbearable. It was as if the weight of the look, even without face, crushed me. My first reaction was to close the notebook and slowly move away, trying not to make noise. But with each step I took back, it seemed that the figure was getting closer, even without moving. It was as if the forest itself were pushing it toward me. The air became heavier, making my breathing difficult, and I began to sweat cold. Still, I couldn't take my eyes off her, afraid of what might happen if I looked elsewhere. Then, out of nowhere, the figure disappeared. It didn't walk, it didn't run, it just disappeared. But that didn't bring relief. On the contrary, the feeling of being observed became even stronger, as if it was now much closer. I took the notebook and started to walk quickly back to the main track, without looking to the sides. Everything around me seemed darker, and the sounds of the forest, wind, leaves, disappeared completely. When I finally reached the car, I could barely open the door, so trembling that my hands were. As soon as I entered, I locked the doors and took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. But looking in the rearview mirror, I saw something that almost made me lose control. The figure was standing there at the edge of the forest, watching me as I left. I drove as fast as I could, but my mind kept repeating that image in the rearview mirror. It was as if the non-existent eyes of that figure were engraved in the bottom of my mind. The road home, which was usually quiet, seemed endless. The feeling of being followed did not leave me for a second. Every shadow on the road, every headlight in the rearview mirror, made me look over my shoulder. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors and windows, arrived twice, and threw the notebook on the table. The silence in the house was overwhelming, but at least I was away from that forest, or so I thought. I decided to open the notebook again, trying to understand better what I had found. Some pages were torn, as if someone had ripped out important information. But what was still there was enough to make me terrified. He mentioned additional tapes, each with a specific purpose. The first was an introduction, the second a warning, and the others, he did not specify how many, were described as the entrance to something no one should see. It was when I realized something that made my stomach turn. At the end of one of the pages, there was a name written. My name. He was there, among the notes, as if I had already been involved before even finding the tapes. When I saw my name in the notebook, I almost knocked it down. My heart went wild, and my vision was blurred for a few seconds. It didn't make sense. How could my name be there, in notes made decades before? I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, but the handwriting was clear and deliberate, as if the writer knew exactly what he was doing. My chest was gripped by the idea that I was connected to something far beyond what I could comprehend. I closed the notebook quickly, as if that was enough to erase what I had seen, and stood up, walking from side to side, trying to decide what to do. Then I heard a low, continuous sound coming from the room. It was static, the same sound I heard in the tapes. My blood froze. The TV was off, as was the VCR, but the sound was unmistakable. I took the notebook and approached the room, hesitant, each step heavier than the previous one. When I came in, the TV was on, even though I hadn't touched anything. The screen was static, but there was something different this time. In the lower right corner, almost out of sight, was the silhouette of the same figure. She seemed smaller, but not less oppressive. And then, as if synchronized with my thought, the sound of static stopped, and a single phrase echoed through the room. "You have been chosen." That phrase, "you were chosen," seemed to echo throughout the house, even after the sound ceased. My body was paralyzed, as if I were frozen in place. The TV went silent again, but the image of the figure was still there, motionless, occupying that corner of the screen. It was as if she was staring at me, even without a face. The feeling that something bigger was happening suffocated me. The notebook was still in my hand, and for a moment I thought about throwing it away, but I knew that it would not change anything. It was too late to turn back. I took the remote, trying to turn off the TV, but the buttons did not respond. The figure was still there, now more crisp, as if it was taking shape. Suddenly, the TV shut off by itself, plunging the room into a suffocating darkness. It was at that moment that I realized I was no longer alone. The air around me seemed heavier, and a cold took over the environment. The kind of cold that does not come from an air conditioner, but something that does not belong to this world. I heard a sound behind me, slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking around the house. My breath was stuck, and my muscles were locked. I knew I couldn't look back, but my curiosity was greater than fear. When I finally turned around, the hall was empty, but I knew that it did not mean that I was safe. My mind was in complete chaos. I knew something was there, even if I could not see it. The silence in the corridor was almost palpable, and each shadow seemed to move imperceptibly, as if waiting for the right moment to attack. I took my phone in an attempt to call someone, but the screen was black, as if the battery had run out again. It did not make sense. Everything seemed to be controlled by something beyond my comprehension. I went back to the room, trying to think what to do, but the notebook on the table caught my attention once again. The last page, which I thought was blank, now had something written. My vision became blurred as I approached reading. "You're on the next record." These words, written in the same frantic handwriting, made me feel as if the ground had disappeared. What did that mean? Was it a warning or a sentence? Before I could think straight, I heard that static sound again. But now it wasn't coming from the TV. It was coming from inside the house, echoing through the rooms, getting louder and louder. The feeling of being observed returned with full force, and I no longer knew whether I was being followed or surrounded. Then suddenly the lights started flashing wildly, casting shadows everywhere. In the middle of this chaos, I saw the figure. She was standing in the hall, but this time it seemed to move erratically, like a distorted reflection in the mirror. And for the first time, I felt that I would not leave that night the way I came in. The figure in the corridor looked different this time. It was no longer just a static presence. It seemed to be coming alive, moving slowly and disjointedly, as if testing its own limits. Each movement made a low sound, like wood squeaking, but there was no weight in the steps. It was as if it were closer to a solid shadow than to something physical. I was paralyzed, my mind trying to decide between fighting or running away, but in fact I knew that none of those options would make a difference. It was like facing something inevitable. The figure stopped, tilted his head almost curiously, and then I heard the voice. It was low and distorted, but clearly articulated. "Your turn." Those words were like a trigger. My body finally reacted, and I ran to the front door without thinking. The handle was cold as ice, but this time the door opened easily. I ran outside, the fresh night air hitting my face, but the feeling that it was following me did not disappear. When I looked back, hoping to see the picture on the doorframe, there was nothing. The house was completely dark, as if it were abandoned. I took the notebook that was still in my hands and threw it into the car seat before speeding away. I didn't have a destination. I just wanted to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. But while I was driving, one thing did not leave my head. What if that had never stayed in the house? While driving, I could not stop looking in the rear-view mirror. Every Pharaoh far away, every shadow on the road seemed something approaching. The notebook was thrown on the passenger's seat, but it was as if he had weight, as if the presence of that thing was attached to him. I thought about stopping the car and throwing it on the road, but something inside of me said that it wouldn't work. It wasn't something that was so easily gotten away from. I continued driving, with my hands sweaty on the wheel, until I arrived in a more crowded area of the city. The street lights and movement of people gave me a false sense of security, but the weight in my chest did not decrease. It was as if I had crossed a line without return. When I finally got home, my family's house where I grew up, far from the other one, I felt a little more at ease. I locked the doors, closed the windows, and even left the lights on in all rooms. The notebook was now on the kitchen table, but I refused to open it. I decided to take a shower in an attempt to relieve the tension. As the water ran, I began to feel a little more normal, almost convinced that it had been left behind. But when I came out of the bathroom, with the towel on my shoulders, I noticed something that made my stomach freeze. The notebook, which I had left in the kitchen, was now in the center of the room. Open, and written on the page where my name was, there was a new message: "You are still with me." The mirror of the camera. Watching the tapes was my biggest mistake. Now they're watching me. After everything that happened, I couldn't get rid of the tapes. It was as if they had a power over me, a kind of obsession that prevented me from leaving them aside. I decided to watch them again, hoping to find some clue that could help me understand what was going on. Turned on the VCR and pressed the play, with a strange feeling in the chest, as if something bad was about to happen. The first recording started exactly as I remembered: the forest, the distant sounds, and that static figure in the background of the image. But as I watched, something seemed different. At one point in the video, I noticed a shadow moving away from me, but it wasn't the faceless figure. It was someone. Put the tape and rewind, focused on that part. As you better analyze, my stomach turned. The silhouette that appeared on the screen was mine. I was wearing the same clothes as the day I found the first tape. My heart popped. How could that be? I never recorded it. I kept watching, with sweaty hands and wide eyes. The camera followed my silhouette through the forest, but from angles I could never have filmed. It was as if someone were watching me while I walked. The feeling of being followed, which had tormented me before, now made more sense, and was even more frightening. My mind was in complete chaos as I continued watching. The camera seemed to follow me with precision, capturing moments I didn't even remember having lived. It was as if someone or something had been there with me all the time, documenting every step I took. In the recording, there was a specific moment that made me sweat. I appeared standing still, looking directly at the camera, but in the forest where the light barely reached. Only I did not remember doing it. My face was visible, but empty, as if it were not me. It was a version of myself, but without any emotion. I moved the tape forward, trying to find more answers, but everything became even stranger. The footage started to cut to impossible angles, as if the camera was filming from above in the middle of the trees. The images showed something that looked like a chase, with my silhouette running through the forest, looking back as if it was fleeing from something. But I didn't remember running. The sound also changed. In addition to the whispers and static, there was now a panting breath, as if someone was running along with the camera. My heart was at 1,000. Every second, it seemed that the tape was not only showing something from the past, but somehow revealing the present, as if I was being watched at that moment. With each second that passed, the feeling of being observed became unbearable. The tape continued, now alternating between images of me walking in the forest and angles that made no sense, as if the camera was floating. At one point, the footage was static for a few seconds, and then a new scene appeared. It was the inside of a house. My stomach turned when I realized it was my home. The camera seemed to be filming the main corridor, just like I saw it every day. It didn't make sense. That wasn't possible. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, but the details were too precise, from the carpet to the paintings on the wall. As the camera continued to film inside my house, the panting breath became louder, closer. The angle of the shot changed to my bedroom door, my room, where I was at that exact moment. My whole body froze. I turned off the TV on impulse, but the sound of breathing continued. It came from inside the house. It was low, irregular, and seemed to be moving around the rooms. I took my phone, but the battery was completely empty, even if I had charged it hours before. I stood up slowly, trying not to make a noise, and walked to the door of the room. Each step seemed to weigh a ton. My ear was pressed against the wood, and at the same moment I heard a slow, strong, and deliberate beat on the other side. My breath was stuck in the chest. The knock on the door was slow, but it carried a weight that was not only physical. It was as if something was on the other side, waiting for me to react. My instinct screamed not to open, but the curiosity and fear mixed me paralyzed. The house was plunged into an almost palpable silence, and the only thing I could hear, besides the muffled sound of my own breath, was the slight scratch coming from the door. It was as if someone was brushing his nails on the wood, without haste, only to let me know that it was there. Held the doorknob with trembling hands, trying to decide what to do. Suddenly the sound stopped. The silence that came after was even worse. He didn't know if it was because it had gone away or because he was waiting for me to take the initiative. I took a deep breath and finally turned the handle, opening the door slowly. The corridor was empty, lit only by the dim light of the room, but something was wrong. The air was heavier, as if something invisible occupied the space. The feeling of being observed was overwhelming. It was then that I realized the TV in the room, which I had turned off, was on again, and the static filled the environment. On the screen, something moved. It was the reflection of the corridor where I was, but with a dark figure standing at the end, watching me. My heart almost stopped when I noticed the picture on the screen. It was standing at the end of the corridor, still, but completely visible in the reflection of the TV. The problem was that, looking directly at the corridor, it still looked empty. Only on the screen, it was as if she's standing there, staring at me, even without a face. Every second felt like an eternity, and I didn't know what to do. My eyes alternated between the TV and the corridor, trying to understand what was happening. The feeling of being observed was so intense that it seemed physical, as if something was pressing on my shoulders. Before I could react, the figure on the screen began to move. Slowly, she advanced through the corridor, but still did not make any sound. The detail that made me most terrified was that she seemed to watch me through the TV, as if she knew I was watching. I walked away a few steps, keeping my eyes fixed on the corridor, but nothing appeared there. Every second, the picture was closer on the screen until it stopped exactly where I was. And that's when everything got worse. The light of the corridor blinked once, and when it came back I saw a shadow indistinct to my side on the floor, reflected in the wall. There was no more doubt. That was with me inside the house. That shadow next to me made my whole body freeze. I could barely breathe, and the only thing my mind kept repeating was that I needed to get out of there, but my legs just didn't respond. The corridor was still empty to my eyes, but the TV showed the figure standing beside me, immobile but clearly present. The reflection on the wall confirmed I was no longer alone. My heart was racing, and all I could do was to slowly back up towards the room. With each step I took, the shadow seemed to get closer, even without moving. It was as if the space around me was changing to corner me. I got to the room and turned quickly to look at the TV. The static had gone, and now the screen showed a live image of where I was. It was an impossible angle, as if someone were filming inside their own house. In the center of the picture, I could see myself clearly on my back looking at the TV. But there was something behind me much sharper now. The figure was there, faceless, but his presence was overwhelming. Suddenly I felt something rub my shoulder, a cold touch, almost icy. Before I could react, the TV turned off by itself, plunging the room into darkness. And in that oppressive silence, I heard a single word whispered directly into my ear. Now. That whisper, now, was like a direct shock in my system. I turned at the same instant, but there was nothing there, only the darkness of the room and the sound of my heavy breathing. My mind was in complete chaos, trying to figure out if it was real or some kind of hallucination. But the feeling on my shoulder, that cold touch, was still there, as if it had marked my skin. I decided I needed to leave the house immediately. I went to the door, stumbling over the furniture, trying not to look back. My hands were shaking so much that I could hardly turn the key. But finally the door opened, and I ran out into the street. The fresh night air should have brought me relief, but it did not. The feeling of being observed continued, as if it had followed me. I looked back, hoping to see the picture on the doorframe, but the house was completely dark and quiet, as if everything had returned to normal. My car was parked just ahead, and I ran to it without thinking twice. When I went in and locked the doors, I forced myself to take a deep breath. But it was then that I realized something that made my blood freeze. In the rearview mirror, the figure was sitting in the back seat, immobile, faceless, but so present that it seemed to consume all the space around me. For a moment, I was frozen, not knowing what to do. My mind screamed that I needed to get out of the car, but my body did not respond. The figure in the mirror did not move, but its presence was overwhelming, as if it was draining all the energy around me. My hands trembled so much that I could barely hold the steering wheel. I looked away to try to convince myself that it was not real, but deep down I knew I wasn't imagining. When I looked again in the rear-view mirror, the picture was no longer there. The back seat seemed empty. Only that the feeling that something was with me did not go away. Without thinking too much, I turned the key on the ignition and accelerated. I had no destination. I just wanted to put as much distance between me and that thing. As I drove, I tried to look back, but the dark of the bench seemed deeper than it should. It was as if something was there, hidden, waiting. My mind was at 1,000, trying to reason, but every shadow on the road seemed to come alive. That's when I heard it. A low sound, almost like a whisper, coming from inside the car. "You can't escape." My vision blurred for a second, but I continued to drive, with my heart racing and panic taking over. I had no idea where it would end, or if it would end. The final choice. What would you do if you knew the only way to survive is not to look back? When I found the third tape, I knew that I had reached the point where I could not run away. I can't explain what led me to it. It was as if I had been guided, almost against my will. She was on the doorstep of my house, in a simple box, without any note this time. Took the tape carefully, heart pounding, and entered quickly, as if to prevent anyone from seeing me. Locked the door and stood in the room, staring at that object that seemed to pulse in my hands, loaded with something I still did not fully understand. I knew watching it meant crossing a line, but I couldn't help myself. It was already up to my neck. I put the tape on the video, almost as an automatic reflex, and pressed play. The screen went black for a few seconds before the image of a forest appeared. The same as always, but something was different. This time the camera did not shake or move. It was as if I was waiting for something to happen. After a minute of absolute silence, a voice echoed, low and distorted but clear enough to be understood. "Leave everything or come to us." My heart popped. There was no doubt that it was for me. As I processed those words, the camera began to move, as if being guided into the forest deeper and deeper, towards an almost palpable darkness. The camera kept moving, now entering an area of the forest that looked unlike anything I had seen before. The trees were larger, denser, and the little light that was passing through seemed to be sucked into the darkness. The panting breath coming from behind the camera was louder than ever, almost rhythmic, as if following someone's steps. I could barely blink, hoping that something appeared, but the tension was just coming from the void. Then, the camera stopped abruptly. She was pointing at a small circle of stones on the ground, the same I had seen in the previous tape. The silence was broken again by the same voice, only this time it was louder, closer. "Choose." That one word seemed to echo in my head, even after the recording continued. The camera started to shake, and that's when I realized it wasn't the recording that was shaking. It was me. My whole body was taken by an indescribable dread, and I could not move. On the canvas, something began to appear around the circle of stones. Silhouettes, indistinct, more undeniably human. They stood watching, and then one by one turned their heads to the camera. It was not a generic message. It was for me. And at that moment, I understood that leaving everything did not just mean the tapes. It meant giving up trying to understand or fight against what was happening. As I watched those figures around the circle, each turning their heads slowly towards the camera, I felt something closing around me. It was not just fear, it was as if the room itself was shrinking, pressing me to make a choice. The voice came back, now louder and almost whispered in the background of my mind. "Leave everything or come to us." The camera stays fixed on the silhouettes for a few seconds before it starts moving again. Only this time, it seemed to be being carried into the circle. My breath became heavier, and I knew that whatever was waiting in the center was not something I should see. Suddenly, the recording was cut off by static, but in the middle of the squeal, something started to appear on the screen. It was an image of myself. I was sitting exactly where I was at that moment, looking directly at the TV, but my reflection seemed empty, like a shell. The figure in the video stood up, but I was still motionless on the couch, watching. My whole body became stiff when the figure on the screen started to walk. She was leaving the room that appeared on the recording, but the sound of the steps, they came from the corridor of my house. Whatever was on the tape wasn't just a video. It was a bridge, and something was going through. The steps in the corridor were slow and rhythmic, each echoing louder than the previous one. The TV still showed that empty version of me, but now the angle had changed. It seemed that the camera was following the steps, leaving the room and heading towards the corridor. The same corridor I knew something was now walking. My body was completely still, but my mind was 1,000, trying to find some logic, some explanation. Only that there was. The sound stopped right at the entrance of the room, and I knew, before even looking, that I was no longer alone. I turned my face slowly, with my heart almost coming out of my chest. The space seemed to writhe, as if everything around me was wrong. When I finally looked at the entrance, there was nothing there, but the reflection on the TV said otherwise. In the corner of the screen, the figure was standing, watching me. It was the same thing without a face, but now more clear, closer, as if it had finally crossed the barrier between what was real and what should not exist. The voice came back, but this time it didn't come from the tape. It came from inside the room. The choice is yours. That's when I got it. I had two options: destroy the tapes, cut any connection with that, or continue, dive in for good and find out what was waiting for me on the other side. I knew I didn't have much time to decide. The weight of being in the room was almost unbearable, as if the air around me was being sucked. I looked at the tapes on the table and then at the TV, which now showed only static but still seemed alive. Destroying the tapes seemed the only logical way, but something inside me hesitated. It was as if a part of me was already connected to that, as if destroying the tapes meant losing more than just videos, maybe even my own sanity. I took one of the ribbons, and the heat in my hand was almost human. It didn't make sense, but it seemed like the object was alive. The figure on TV did not disappear. Even with the static, his silhouette was still there, motionless but oppressive. Took the tape and went to the kitchen, where a small trash can was full of crumpled paper. Picked up a match, my hands shaking so much I almost dropped it. I lit it and brought it closer to the ribbon, waiting for it to catch fire. But before I could do anything, the voice echoed again, this time so clear that it seemed to be inside my head. If you destroy yourself, it will be your end. If you continue, you will see ours. The match fell, and the flame was extinguished on the ground. My breath was heavy, and the choice became more and more impossible. I stood in the kitchen with the tape in hand, trying to catch my breath. The voice still echoed in my mind, and the pressure in the environment seemed to be increasing. I looked at the tape, almost hoping it would give me some sign, some answer. It was ridiculous, but it didn't seem just an object. It was as if he was watching me, waiting for my decision. I went back to the room, dropping the tape on the table with force, as if I wanted to get rid of the weight it represented. But when I looked up at the TV, the picture was sharper. No longer in the corner of the screen. Now I was right in the center, staring directly at me, even without eyes. The static became higher, almost unbearable, and the image began to shake. It was then that I realized something that made me freeze. The reflection on TV was no longer just mine. The figure was now standing behind me, so close that I could feel the air around me change. My whole body froze. I couldn't turn around. I knew that if I looked back, it would end there. But how to resist the curiosity, the fear of confirming what I already knew? The voice came back, lower this time, almost a whisper. Choose now, or we will choose for you. My hands were sweating, and my mind was screaming for me to run. But something deeper told me that there was nowhere to run. My hands were so trembling that it was hard to think. The reflection on TV seemed more real every second, and I knew I could not go on in that room. The voice kept whispering, but now it was everywhere, as if the house itself were talking to me. Took the tape from the table as a reflection and ran outside, not knowing exactly what to do. The fresh night air did not bring relief. The weight of that choice was still with me and seemed to follow me wherever I went. I ran to the yard, tape still tight in my hand, and looked at the house. The lights were flashing, and the static TV was audible even outside. I knew I had to destroy it, end it all. I took a gallon of gasoline that was in the corner of the garage and poured it over the tape, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched from all sides. Lit a match and threw it on. The flames quickly rose, but instead of feeling like relief, the fire seemed wrong. It was darker, almost oppressive, and the sound of static became louder from inside the house. When I looked out the window, my blood froze. The figure was standing there watching me, and for the first time it moved. He did not walk or run. He just tilted his head in a way that seemed like a gesture of disapproval, as if he knew that destroying the tape would make no difference. The flames consumed the tape quickly, but the discomfort did not disappear. In fact, it seemed that the feeling of being observed had become more intense. The figure in the window remained still, head still tilted, as if analyzing every movement of mine. It was as if burning it had solved nothing, or worse, as if it had caused something. My instinct was to get out of there as soon as possible, but my legs were heavy, as if something held me. The static, which seemed to come from inside the house, now echoed through the yard, mixing with a low and guttural sound, like a muffled laugh. Suddenly all the lights in the house went out at once. The darkness was so dense that it seemed to expand beyond the house, swallowing up the yard. The only thing visible was the window where the figure was, but now it had disappeared. My heart shot. The silence that followed was even more disturbing. Even in the dark, I knew something was moving around me. Then I heard again, choice made. The voice no longer whispered. It was loud, almost vibrant, as if it were coming from inside my head. And at the same instant, I felt a deep cold behind me, as if someone was standing there so close that he could touch my skin. I couldn't turn. The cold I felt behind me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just physical. It was as if the energy around me was being drained away. My breath was heavy, and every muscle of my body seemed to be locked in, as if it wanted to keep me still. The silence around me was overwhelming, but the feeling that something was there, so close, was even worse. I closed my eyes, trying to gather courage to move, but the voice came back, clearer than ever. You chose us. My body reacted to instinct. I leaped forward, trying to get away from anything that was behind me. I ran to the front gate, but looking back by reflection, I realized there was nothing there. Nothing visible, at least. But the feeling of being followed remained as strong as before. I got to the car, went in and slammed the door hard, my hands shaking as I tried to turn the key on the ignition. When I finally got the engine started, I looked in the rear view mirror and my blood froze. The figure was in the back seat, immobile, but his presence was almost suffocating. No more doubts. No matter what I had done, it was with me now forever. The last message, I should never have found these tapes, but now they will always find me. When I decided to burn the tapes, I thought that would be the end of everything. I took the 3, along with the box in which they were, and went straight to the forest where it all began. It made no sense to keep them or try to find out, but I knew I was dealing with something far beyond what I could understand. The path to the clearing was quieter than usual. There was no wind, no sound of leaves or birds, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I arrived at the same point where I found the first tape, with a small can of fuel and a match. My hand trembled as I poured the liquid over the ribbons, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. As soon as I lit the match and threw it, the fire rose quickly, consuming everything. The heat was intense, and for a moment I felt relief, as if I had finally broken that cycle. But then a sound began. At first it felt like wind, but I soon realized that it was whispering from all directions. The forest, so silent before, now seemed alive. I looked around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. It was then that I realized the whispers were not just around me. They were exactly like the sounds of the recordings. Steps, distorted laughter, and that heavy breath. It was as if the ribbons had brought the forest to life. The whispers grew louder, as if they were approaching from all sides. The forest seemed to gain movement. The trees, which were once just trees, now seemed to bend their shadows in an impossible way, almost as if they were stretching towards me. The fire that consumed the tapes began to diminish, but the sound around me increased, mixing static with voices that almost formed words. It was then that I noticed something even more strange. In the center of the flames, the ribbons were no longer crumbling. They seemed intact, as if the fire did not really hit them. The heat was real, but the ribbons did not burn. My whole body was on alert, and all I could think of was that I needed to get out of there. I took my backpack and ran, without direction, but knowing that I could not continue in that place. However, the more I ran, the more it seemed that I did not leave the place. The trees became more and more dense, and the sound of whispers accompanied me, now more distinct. I began to recognize some of the voices. It was my own, mixed with others that I didn't know. It was when I realized something that made me stop abruptly. Between the trees on the ground, there was another tape, perfectly positioned as if it had been left for me. Next to her, a camera pointed directly at me, with the red light blinking, as if it was recording me. I froze. The camera seemed to watch me, the red light blinking at a pace that seemed almost deliberate, like a breath. The tape next to it was clean, without dust, as if it had been placed there a few minutes ago. My heart was beating so fast that I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears. Everything in me said not to come near, but somehow I knew I had no choice. I walked slowly to the camera, each step making the sound of whispers around me seem louder. As I got close, I noticed that the lens was slightly tilted, as if it had been adjusted to follow me as I moved. The tape was picked up with trembling hands, but before I could do anything, the camera shut off by itself. Silence returned, but it brought no relief. Instead, he brought an even heavier presence, as if something was waiting for me to make the next move. It was then that I heard a familiar sound: static. I looked up and saw, among the trees, the reflection of a screen. I walked towards the light, almost as if being guided, until I found an old TV covered in moss. The screen showed my house, filmed from inside. The framing was perfect, as if someone was in the room now, holding the camera. The voice came back, now clear as ever: "They will always be watching." That phrase, "They will always be watching," seemed to echo inside my head, as if it was not just a sound, but a warning recorded on me. I stood there, staring at the TV in the middle of the forest, not knowing what to do. The image of my house was not an old recording. It was live. The lights were on exactly as I had left them, and the angles showed each room in a way that only someone inside it could capture. My heart popped. Who was there? How was that possible? But the worst part was when the camera turned towards the front door, as if it knew I was watching. The door was open. A shiver took hold of my body, and the static on the TV began to intensify, filling the forest with that oppressive sound. I could not look away from the screen, even when I felt something moving behind me. My vision was fixed in the image, but my whole body screamed for me to run. Before I could react, the TV went out, and darkness took over. But the sound continued, static mixed with steps coming from all sides. I took the tape that was on the camera and ran. I don't know how, but I managed to find my way back to the car. I entered, locking the doors, but the feeling that something was with me did not disappear. On the seat next to it, the tape seemed to pulse like a heart. While driving, my mind was in complete chaos. Every shadow on the road, every sound of the engine seemed to amplify the feeling that I was not alone. The tape on the bench next to me seemed heavier than it should be, almost as if it had its own gravity, pulling all my attention. I looked at her for a second, but the fear of turning my eyes away from the road was greater. The feeling that something was with me inside the car was unbearable. I forced myself to look in the rear view mirror, hoping to see something, but the back seat was empty, at least visually. The air seemed heavy, as if an invisible presence occupied the space. When I finally got home, I felt a momentary relief that everything was as I had left it. But this relief lasted only for a short time. As soon as I entered, I realized that the lights that were on now were off, even though I was sure that I left them on. The tape was still in my hand, and I wanted to get rid of it, but I didn't know how. I put it on the table and sat down on the couch, trying to organize my thoughts. That's when I heard a low, steady sound like static began to fill the room. It didn't come from any electronics. It seemed to come from inside the walls. I looked at the tape on the table, and it seemed to vibrate slightly, as if it were alive. Before I could react, all the lights went out at once, and the house plunged into darkness. The blackout was so sudden that it left me paralyzed. The silence that followed was almost deafening, interrupted only by the low and continuous sound of static. Even in the darkness, I could feel the weight of the tape on the table, as if it was dominating the environment. My whole body was on alert, and every sound, even my own breath, seemed amplified. I took my phone to use as a flashlight, but the battery, which was almost full minutes before, was now dead. That was no coincidence. My heart popped, and I knew I had to get out of there, but something held me in place. Then I heard footsteps. They were slow, heavy, and came from the corridor leading to the rooms. Each step made the ground creak, as if someone was approaching slowly without haste. My mind was in panic. There was no one in the house when I left, but now it was clear that I was not alone anymore. The tape on the table began to emit a faint, almost imperceptible glow, but enough to slightly illuminate the room. When I looked towards the corridor, I saw a shadow at the end, still but unmistakable. It was the same figure that followed me from the beginning, without face, but with a presence that seemed to suffocate everything around. And then, as if he knew I was looking, the figure tilted his head slowly, as a gesture of recognition. The head tilt was enough to make me freeze in place. I wanted to run, but my legs didn't respond. The figure did not move, but the feeling that she was getting closer and closer was almost unbearable. The faint glare of the tape continued, and for some reason it seemed to connect everything: the static, the steps, and that presence. My hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped the tape when I took it again. Maybe if it was thrown away, everything would stop. Maybe it was connected to her in a way that I still didn't understand. But before I could decide what to do, the figure took the first step towards me. The sound of the steps was low, but each one seemed heavier than the previous one, as if the ground were giving way. The figure walked slowly, almost as if it wanted to give me time to react, but I could not do anything except watch. Then she stopped at the edge of the room, a few meters from me. There was no face, but I could feel the stare burning, as if she were watching my every move. It was then that the static changed. From a random and chaotic sound, words began to form words, low and distorted, but clear enough for me to understand. You will never escape. The figure took another step, and the light of the ribbon blinked, illuminating the space between us for a brief second. What I saw at that moment made my blood cold. She was not just a shadow, it was me, or at least a distorted version of myself. The shock of seeing that distorted version of myself, almost made me fall to the ground. It was not only physical form, it was the absence of something human, as if it were an empty reflection, a shell. My mind tried desperately to find logic in it, but nothing made sense. The figure did not move anymore, but the weight of its presence was almost unbearable. And then, in the oppressive silence, the static spoke again. This time, the message was clear, without interruptions. You made your choice. The words seemed not only to be heard, but felt, as if they were being recorded in my mind. The brightness of the tape in my hand increased, lighting up the whole room for a few seconds, and it was at that moment that I realized something even more terrifying. The walls around me were covered with shadows, not only of the figure, but in various other ways, all standing watching me. They were not defined figures, but distorted presences, almost as if the very darkness was alive. The air became heavy, and the static sound was getting louder, filling every corner of the room. It was as if everything was converging to that moment. The figure before me took another step, reached out his hand, and the light of the ribbon disappeared, plunging everything into complete darkness.